Every superpower in history tried to conquer Afghanistan. Every single one failed. The Persian Empire, Alexander the Great, the Mongols, the British, the Soviets, the United States. Between them, they commanded the greatest armies in human history. They had every advantage. They won every major battle, and every single one of them eventually packed up and left. The question nobody has ever truly answered is why the same land keeps breaking every empire that touches it, and why it keeps happening. If you have ever wondered why the most powerful forces in history kept making the same mistake in the same place, subscribe to History Brief. We go deeper than the textbook version every single time. This is not just a story about terrain or weapons or tactics. It is about something far more dangerous to any empire, a people who simply refuse to be owned, a land where the concept of surrender does not exist, where tribes that spend centuries fighting each other will unite overnight against any outsider who tries to rule them, and where every foreign army that has ever marched in has eventually marched out, broken, depleted, and humiliated. To find the answer, you have to go back to where the pattern first appeared, not to America, not to the British, all the way back to the first superpower in human history, and the moment the land first showed what it was capable of. Around 500 BCE, Darius I of the Persian Empire marched his army into the region we now call Afghanistan. The Persians were the most organized military force the ancient world had ever produced. They had already conquered Egypt, Babylon, and most of the known world. Afghanistan should have been straightforward, and in a sense it was. The Persians won every open battle they fought. The local tribes could not match them in the field. Afghan cities fell. Territory was taken. On paper, the conquest was complete. But here is what the maps did not show. The moment the Persian army moved on, the tribes came back. Governors were killed. Garrisons were overrun. Control evaporated the second it was not enforced at the end of a spear. The Persians never lost Afghanistan in battle. They simply could not afford to station enough soldiers in every valley, on every mountain pass, in every remote corner of a country that seemed to have no end. Afghanistan was not conquered. It was temporarily occupied. And there is a difference. Then came Alexander. In 330 BCE, Alexander the Great swept through the Persian Empire and arrived at the eastern edge of the known world. He had never lost a battle in his life. His army had defeated forces 10 times its size. He looked at Afghanistan and saw the final piece of his empire. He spent 3 years there, 3 years, longer than it took him to conquer the entire Persian Empire. He won every major engagement. He founded cities. He married Roxana of Bactria, a local noblewoman, specifically to legitimize his rule. He tried everything a conqueror could try. But the mountains hid fighters who refused to stay defeated. The moment his army secured one valley, the next was already in revolt. His supply lines were cut. His soldiers were ambushed on passes so narrow that 2 men could barely walk side by side. He lost more troops to guerrilla warfare in Afghanistan than in any pitched battle of his entire campaign. Alexander himself reportedly said, "The land was easy to march into, but difficult to march out of." He eventually left, not defeated in battle, but exhausted by a war that had no front line, no enemy capital, and no moment of final victory. Every empire that followed would discover the same thing: win the battle, lose the country. The Mongols arrived in the 13th century under Genghis Khan, the most feared military force in human history. They had burned cities from China to Eastern Europe. They had massacred entire civilizations. In Afghanistan, they did the same. When the ancient city of Herat rebelled after its initial conquest, the Mongols returned and killed an estimated 1.6 million people, one of the largest massacres in recorded history. They wanted to make an example so devastating that no Afghan city would ever resist again. Within decades, the Mongol grip had loosened anyway. The tribes regrouped. The same pattern: initial victory, temporary occupation, inevitable collapse. Then came the British, and this time the consequences were not just military, they were catastrophic. In the 19th century, the British Empire controlled roughly 1/4 of the entire Earth's surface. It had built the most sophisticated colonial administration in history. It had never met a territory it could not eventually subdue. It invaded Afghanistan 3 separate times between 1838 and 1919. The first invasion began with confidence. A British army of around 16,000 soldiers and camp followers marched into Kabul in 1839 and installed a ruler loyal to the crown. For 2 years, everything appeared stable. Then the tribes rose. In January 1842, the British were forced to retreat from Kabul through the mountain passes in the dead of winter. What followed was not a military retreat. It was a massacre. 16,000 people entered those passes. Fighters ambushed them from every ridge, every cliff, every narrow corridor of rock and ice. The cold killed those the ambushes missed. Of the British officers who began that retreat, only one, an army surgeon named William Brydon, reached the garrison at Jalalabad alive. He arrived alone, wounded, on a dying horse. The image of a single officer emerging from the passes became one of the most iconic symbols of military catastrophe in British history. It taught the British something they never forgot, that Afghanistan did not simply resist conquest. It consumed armies. The British invaded twice more. Both times, the result was the same. They recognized Afghan independence in 1919, not as an act of generosity, as an admission that the cost of continuing was too high to justify. And then the most powerful military in human history tried. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a failing communist government. They had nuclear weapons, attack helicopters, satellite intelligence, and a professional army hardened by decades of Cold War preparation. Afghanistan had mountain fighters with outdated rifles and an absolute refusal to surrender. The Soviets stayed for 10 years, 15,000 soldiers dead, hundreds of billions of dollars spent. When they finally withdrew in February 1989, they left behind a shattered army and a collapsing economy. Nearly 3 years later, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. Historians still debate how much the Afghanistan catastrophe accelerated its fall. The answer is probably more than any of them are comfortable admitting. The United States arrived in 2001 with the full weight of the most technologically advanced military in human history behind it. 20 years, $2 trillion. They did not just try to win militarily, they tried to rebuild the entire country: roads, schools, hospitals, a national government, a trained army, functioning institutions. In August 2021, they withdrew. Within 11 days, the Taliban had retaken every major city in the country. The government collapsed, the army dissolved. Everything built over 2 decades was gone in less than 2 weeks. So what is the real reason? It is not the mountains, although they help. It is not the poverty, although it plays a role. The real reason is something recorded by a British diplomat named Mount Stuart Elphinstone, who travelled through Afghanistan in 1809 and documented the attitudes of the tribes he encountered. In his account of the Kingdom of Kabul, he described a people with a deep and unshakable resistance to any form of outside authority. The sentiment he recorded, whether in these exact words or close to them, has been echoed by Afghan leaders and tribal elders across centuries. We will never be content with a master. Every empire that entered Afghanistan brought the same assumption, that with enough force, enough money, and enough time, any people can be made to accept a ruler they did not choose. Afghanistan has spent 2,500 years proving that assumption wrong. Not because its fighters are unbeatable in open combat. They are not. But because you cannot conquer a people who do not recognize your authority to begin with. You can win every battle and still lose the war. 2,500 years. 6 of the greatest military forces in human history. The same result every time. At some point, that stops being a coincidence and starts being an answer. If history keeps proving the same lesson and the world keeps ignoring it, there are plenty more stories like this one waiting for you on this channel. Subscribe and make sure you do not miss what comes next.